All right, good evening, folks. Pleasure to have you all here. My name is Justin Parsher. I'm an assistant professor of practice here in the landscape architecture section at Knowlton. And tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce Claire Napawan. Napawan started in practice with SWA and D-Land Studio, but since 2009 has been at the University of California, Davis, where she is currently professor of landscape architecture and environmental design in the Department of Human Ecology in the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. Did I get that more or less correct?
Yeah, it's like the Russian dolls.
Yeah, just... Awesome. So for much of her academic career, Napawan has been a leading scholar of productive urban landscapes. And one thing that I have long appreciated about her work in that space is that while it is very obvious from the work just how much she cares about urban agriculture and wants it to succeed as a way forward for equitable food access and public space, it is also obvious that she wants to be quite clear about what is not working about the way that it's designed and planned for. And so if landscape architecture over the last decade plus has evolved from thinking about urban agriculture as an all-purpose cure-all and toward a more nuanced understanding of its promises and pitfalls, it is really in large part due to her work. In that same spirit, in recent years, we've seen a turn. Napawan's extended her scope out further to mount a wider critique of the field of landscape architecture as it's come down to us, and to look for effective ways to repair the biases that are inherent in the field. And that has included studies of gendered exclusion and inclusion in public spaces, as well as the challenges and promise of bringing true diversity into the Landscape Architecture Academy. And I want to particularly recommend last year's Decolonizing the Language of Landscape Architecture, which she wrote with one of my old compatriots, Linda Chamorro, Deborah Gunther, and Yue Huang, which is really one of the most thought-provoking and incisive pieces on landscape architecture, full stop, that I've read in quite a long time. In that same open-ended spirit, her design work during her time at UC Davis has questioned the usual methods of landscape practice, tending toward into collaborative projects that take an expanded view of design and community engagement. And that's included social media-based projects like hashtag #SFOpenCity and hashtag #OurChangingClimate, which update the goals of land grant extension work of the kind we all love to meet underserved communities where they live. What about Napawan's work as an educator? Well, in the course of reviewing her work to date, what she's been up to, I stumbled upon something really lovely. It's a passage in a 2022 thesis from a student at UC Davis. And the student describes how back in 2021, students in landscape architecture and environmental design at UC Davis wrote a letter calling for the faculty and staff to make good on promises they had made back in 2020 to remove bias and barriers to true inclusion. And the student goes on to describe how, quote, "In response to this letter, Professor Claire Napawan, along with other faculty, worked with students and a community partner to create DEI landscape architecture materials, took concrete steps to address the students' demands, and enact meaningful change. She spent the following year assessing syllabi, surveying students and faculty, compiling DEI commitments, reviewing traditional texts and alternatives, and exploring new pedagogy within course instruction," end quote. That for me is a really powerful example for all of us, and particularly right now, given the concerted ongoing backlash that we are seeing against institutional efforts to make good on the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that tells you something about the leadership and integrity of Claire Napawan. So please join me in welcoming her tonight.
Make sure this is on. Thank you, Justin. Wow, I hope I can live up to that. That was a very thoughtful introduction. And I only have like 45 minutes to talk about all of that. So buckle it. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to try to focus today on one aspect of my work and try to make this assertion that you see up here. Maintenance as placemaking is kind of one little sliver of the kind of work that I do related to diversity, equity, inclusion within the field, and the research that I've conducted of late and how it relates to both my practice, but also to my pedagogy. So I'll get a little bit more to that. I thought I'd fill out the introduction, although that was amazing. I feel like I would like you to send that to my mom so she knows what I'm doing these days. But I also like to fill out some other pieces that provide some light about myself and the ways in which it informs the work that I've been doing. So, I get asked a lot, where do you come from? And I think it's always kind of an interesting question because it does reveal a lot. And it's a complicated question for me. Justin asked me this earlier, and I said, well, a couple places. So I've spent an equal third of my life in 3 very different places. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My parents are immigrants from Thailand, and that's where they first landed. Then we ended up in Orange County for another 6 years, and so quite literally like a third of my life. And then finally, my formative years, middle school and high school, was spent in a rural community called Bettendorf, Iowa. And so if you can just imagine, we were the only non-white folks in Bettendorf, Iowa at that time. It was a very unique experience. So I just wanted to share that, my introduction now, and this is really within the last decade, has not just been about the work that I do, but really including things like this about my identity as being a mother, a child of immigrants from Southeast Asia, as Ali Wong likes to call it. It's jungle Asian, not fancy Asian, and the different implications of that. And that some of the hardest work that I've done, some of the things that have been the most challenging, time-consuming, and rewarding has also been the fact that I'm a mother. I'm a mother of 3. And I've yet to successfully count any of my children. In my dossier, I haven't really found a good way to put it into my resume or CV or even on my portfolio for a range of reasons, but I'm working on it. I do want to start with talking a little bit about the closest acknowledgement of mothering that I've kind of seen within my research. The kind of first time I've noticed that, okay, maybe this is work that has some value. It's a discipline, it's a study. So that is the term home economics. Has anybody taken a class called home economics when you were in middle school or high school? Some. It was a thing in the past, and it was a class that you learned some cooking, maybe some cleaning tips. Sometimes there was a little bit of sewing or parenting involved in it too. But essentially, it was teaching you some of these, sometimes I referred to now as heirloom skills, but the things that you learn from your mother, potentially. And it was important. It was important because it actually has impact on some economic considerations of domestic life. If you thought about cooking meals and mending clothing and the ways in which that can help to subsidize costs within a family budget. So I thought I would just start with talking about the person who put home economics kind of into the subject catalog of high schools years ago, and that's Ellen Swallow Richards. I love this image of her. So she's the first female instructor at MIT. She's a chemist, okay? And she studied water quality, essentially. She was looking at the ways in which, this is about the time in the late 19th century where there's starting to become an understanding and a relationship of water quality and public health. And she's actually one of the forerunners of that research as a chemist. What I think is really interesting is that as a woman and a wife and certain kinds of stereotypical responsibilities in that era, she was also really interested in the relationship of domestic practices like cooking and cleaning and those impacts on a kind of broader community and urban infrastructural scale. So she starts to say that, okay, the way we manage water, even in a home, even in a kitchen, might have impacts on a broader city. So I just want to mention that this work goes to inform, her work as a chemist goes to inform urban sanitation efforts that continue, the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, right? Work from, Friedrich Law Olmsted, the scientists, the planners, and the engineers that are thinking about ways of improving water quality alongside, making beautiful avenues and boulevards. This is the work of Daniel Burnham in Chicago. And one of the things I really like is that her work actually predates all of this. She just terms it something different. She calls it municipal housekeeping, and I love that term. It just speaks to me more than just urban sanitation, because it recognizes domesticity as a potential role in thinking about kind of broad community networks and their relationship on an infrastructural scale. And so I think that that's where a lot of the inspiration for the kind of work that I've been doing lately comes from, this idea of really making connections between some things that we feel like maybe aren't important, but then you realize that, it's a bigger thread that connects to broader issues. So I just thought I'd share this too. This is, at the same time as that work on City Beautiful movement and urban sanitation projects, this is 1866 cartoon about how water quality is, directly now we're recognizing related to cholera outbreaks. It's called Death's Dispensary, right? And one of the things I love about this image is if you notice the woman and her children and her daughters, they're all carrying the vessels, they're doing the work of collecting the water, and then presumably the father, the husband, is just holding the drinking vessel itself. And so embedded in this is a recognition of water and its potential harm from a public health perspective, but also this other layer of understanding gender roles and whose responsibility it is to participate in the provision of the water, right? So I'm gonna fast forward now almost 100 years, actually pretty much 100 years, to my next sort of person of inspiration, who I think has done a really great job of also acknowledging domestic work as something that can transcend beyond the sort of hidden unpaid labor that we don't put on our dossiers or our resumes. And that's the work of Mirla Latterman-Ukelees. So Mirla Latterman-Ukelees is an environmental artist. She's sort of commensurate with the land earthwork artists like Michael Heitzer and Robert Smithson, but instead of, playing in the deserts of the Southwest, bulldozing soil, she's instead staying in New York City, where she lives, and sort of pursuing her own version of earthwork art there, something that she refers to as maintenance art. And so this is one of her projects where she literally is taking a photo of herself, a Polaroid, of her doing work, domestic work, and calling it maintenance art, and saying, okay, here I am doing my maintenance art 1 hour every day. She writes this manifesto, the Maintenance Art Manifesto, and I'm going to just read one line from part 2 where she describes her newest project. And it goes, I'm an artist, I'm a woman, I'm a wife, and I'm a mother. I do a hell of a lot of washing, cleaning, cooking, renewing, supporting, preserving, etc. I also, in parentheses, up till now, separately, do art. Now I will simply do the maintenance everyday things and flush them up to consciousness and exhibit them as art. And this proposal is accepted at a local gallery, where instead of creating a piece of work that then gets exhibited in this gallery, she decides that she's going to perform maintenance work as part of that practice. So she's cleaning, she's mopping hallways, she's Windexing glass of the different paintings that are hung. Here she is, you can see her sweeping the steps up front. And she argues that this is a contribution to your experience of this place as much as the art that's hanging in the walls. That's her argument, that the practice of cleaning and maintaining is something that's overlooked, but absolutely critical for you to understand this place as operational, right? So it gets photographed and it becomes part of this exhibition. Following that work, she's actually commissioned by the New York City Department of Sanitation to help with a new exhibition, a new art piece that might help to elevate the status of the folks that work for the Department of Sanitation. So these are, traditionally referred to as the trash men, folks, the garbage collectors. And she works with them for a long time, starting to understand the perspectives of what it means to kind of work, drive the garbage trucks, pick up the garbage, and be in a city that doesn't really quite respect the individuals that do what's kind of considered dirty work. I mean, this is labor that is paid, but oftentimes sort of undervalued despite that. And her response to that is this installation, sort of kind of exhibition piece called Touch Sanitation. And so over the course of 9 months, she walks all 5 boroughs, and anytime she encounters someone who works for sanitation, she'll stop them, thank them for their work, and shake their hand. It was just as simple as that. This idea that I, as an artist, will acknowledge now the contribution that you have to this city and its infrastructures, right, through this, mundane task, okay? I think that while there is a lot of respect for the work that Mirla Latterman Ukelees has completed, and she's not the only one. If you're interested, Joe Hansen is doing similar work in California at the same time, thinking about street sweeping as an act of placemaking, maintenance as an important part of that. But it is, in all the textbooks that I have seen, their work is referred to as maintenance art. And I think there's a certain frivolity to it that I'd love to kind of expand beyond, because art isn't what we here as environmental designers do exclusively, right? We make places, right? I'm a landscape architect as well by training, and also pursued urban design in practice. And so when I think about it, there's more to my work than just an exhibition or an installation. There's this idea of placemaking that is really important to me. So I wanted to move that and think through, what is it like to make places and what role does maintenance play in that? And I just wanted to show, a place that I've been to recently on travels. This is Ohori Park in Japan. It's a kind of classic Japanese Zen garden. And this is a kind of place that, although there was an individual that clearly made decisions about where shrubs would be, the size of the water feature, the placement of rocks and trees and paths, I'd like to argue that if you think about it, the actual pruning of those trees and the raking of gravel and the maintenance of this space contributes probably more to the sense of place, right, than the actual physical design, because there's quite a lot of effort that goes into it, right? Okay, and maybe you would argue, well, that makes sense in Japan, right? Japanese gardens have a certain artifice to them. And so as a result of that style, that artifice, of course, the maintenance is a really high priority, and maybe that's not the case in every landscape. So I want to take now the example, a Western example, a kind of classic English picturesque. This is Stourhead. And when I show this to my students, oftentimes they look at this and go, nature. But I just want to make the argument that this landscape, even with its rolling hills and kind of more organic, perhaps, water body and trees that are pruned, but in a way that seems more, quote unquote, naturalistic, is actually as much artifice as the kind of classic Japanese Zen garden, that there's just as much effort put into this landscape to make it look and continue to look like this. I mean, just the lawn mowers involved in keeping that sort of cropped grass, and the pruning in order to get those highland trees. Yes, it's based off of a pastoral landscape that may have been managed at some point with animals, with livestock, but not anymore, right? So now it's like fertilization or fertilizers being applied, pesticides and herbicides, maintenance, just as much maintenance. I want to quote one of my instructor of mine from my GSD days, Peter Del Tredici. He always says, nature abhors a garden. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as landscape architects, is that because we're dealing with landscapes, and landscapes are all about change. Plants grow and die, trees, right, get taller, it rains, the seasons, all these things that happen, it means that they're not static. And the process of design can often yield a kind of idealized static view, a static aesthetic. And so the only way to allow that vision to remain as a designer is through a lot of labor, maintenance, constant maintenance. Now, maintenance has gained some traction in academia, in like thinking about how infrastructure, cities, buildings, landscapes kind of maintain, or how they prevail in light of the climate change and sustainability issues. So this recent acknowledgement this example is from 2016. It's from Aeon magazine, where two academics, Russell and Vinsel, are sort of making this argument for an increased need to really value maintenance. That the innovation of a design of a building is only one piece, and it's more that kind of long-term maintenance that really matters in terms of sustainability metrics, impacts to community experience of this place. I think there's recent research that indicates that, for example, LEED certified buildings often no longer maintain the metrics that qualify them for LEED after a certain number of years. So when we visited, they're no longer meeting those metrics that would have assigned them the LEED standard of gold or silver or platinum or whatnot. But because we haven't really revisited that, we're really focused on the initial investment of LEED certification, like at the time of design, at the time of construction, at the time of innovation. And we forget to think about like that innovation needs to be maintained. It made me think of this. So I was walking and I saw these little robots, and I thought to myself, oh, how innovative. We've eliminated the use of labor in the delivery of whatever happens to be in there. I have no idea. I don't know if it's food or lab samples or whatnot, but I had a very Star Wars moment where I just wanted to like wave my hand and say, these are not the droids you're looking for. Anyhow, right, it's like this excitement we have on innovation, so much so that I'm taking photos and putting it in this lecture. But it did then lead me to say, well, okay, so we've removed the labor of the person who's walking to deliver this, and what a great milestone in technology that is. But my next question is that, who actually maintains these robots then? What's the labor involved in making sure that they continue to operate, right? And this idea that, is the labor that's saved from preventing someone from like couriering something from point A to point B, is that commensurate, or is that exchange really of value when you think about all the efforts that might go into making sure that these machines are operating, right? So that's the kind of questions that I have. And like I said, questions that other scholars are starting to raise. One of the things though, to refer back to that piece from Aeon magazine, is that they are neglecting a piece of it that I think is really important, which is understanding that this conversation on maintenance, on labor, is very much tied to race, class, and gender. So here's an image of Mirella Latterman-Ukele's. She's just approached sanitation workers in New York and is actually now physically helping them pick up the trash that's kind of fallen over. And I just think it's important to note that some of the leading artists in maintenance artwork are women, right? And that most of these paid maintenance positions are typically performed by men, but are associated with lower wage positions, right? With less education. And then when that domestic labor is unpaid, it's almost exclusively performed by women and women of color. So in the United States, women spend an average of 240 minutes per week on unpaid domestic labor. And on average, men in America spend 150 minutes. And so the difference weekly is about 90 minutes. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you paid women minimum wage for that 90-minute difference throughout the course of a year, all women in America, it's $1.5 trillion. So it's substantial, right? Just to think kind of collectively of this undervalued work that is being performed on a daily basis. To return to the Japanese garden as that example, I just wanted to say that in Japan, the work of actually maintaining these gardens is actually really a revered position. They're referred to as the niwishi, which means garden master. And they have uniforms associated with them, there's training, and there's a certain kind of elevated status in being a maintainer in these gardens, right? And I wanted to kind of contrast that with back to the kind of Western picturesque version. This is the work of Humphrey Repton. Hopefully this is familiar for the landscape architecture folks. This is his red books, right? He produced before and after images of the picturesque landscapes which he was proposing, and he did that with this kind of little flip of piece of paper. So if you look at the image above, that's the after, but this flap comes in and you get the kind of before. So this is before Photoshop, but before and after. And one of the things I think is really interesting is that, when I studied these paintings, it was in the context of, pastoral, picturesque English landscapes, and really thinking about the view and appropriating view and the work of livestock in kind of maintaining this landscape. And what we failed to talk about is that if you think about what's actually being obscured, whether that's the row houses here or the quarry workers here, is that labor is deliberately being obscured through the design, right? That is the deliberate intent of the design. And so this issue of class that's kind of embedded in these as before and afters is something that never really came clear to me before. But as I think through this, I'm like, oh, right, we've kind of always looked to obscure the work that's needed to support the things that we design. And many folks might argue that we've evolved in the last 100 years or so, but I would argue that we haven't, because I know so many landscape architects who are offended when they're accidentally referred to as landscapers, right? Because there's an implication, I believe, of class, right? In the term landscaper and landscape architect, right? It's the difference between being a maintainer and a designer. And one of the things I'd like to do is really consider ways in which we overcome those values in distinguishing between those different contributions to placemaking. So, the presence of living materials in landscape architecture, I think, allows us to make that leap a little easier, right? So this is the aerial hedge at Versailles. And obviously, again, this artifice, right? Looking at these living trees and how they have to be so carefully, perfectly pruned in order to create that wall and that sense of space, right? We know trees don't normally grow that way. And so I think on a certain level, it's easy to understand that maintenance is really critical to making this place, right? I think that the question I have, though, is that's one kind of maintenance, right? Landscaping or landscape maintenance. And I'd love to think, are there other forms of maintenance that we might be able to consider placemaking? For example, can cooking be placemaking? Can cleaning be placemaking? I'm going to use this kind of latter part of my lecture to go through a project of mine that I think is an effort to sort of prove that those things can be an essential part of placemaking as much as design. The project is one in collaboration with the City of San Jose, their Department of Transportation and their Environmental Service Department, and dealing with an issue that might not seem very much related to domesticity, but something in which, if we think back to Ellen Swallow Richard's work, maybe, that's the link that we're trying to draw in the long term. So this is data from 2009 to 2011 from City of San Jose. City of San Jose is the southern part of the San Francisco Bay, so that's kind of the tail end of the San Francisco Bay. So part of the Bay Area, fastest growing city in the Bay Area. And the green lines that you see are actually, they're not streets, those are the sewer lines below ground. The circle on top is the wastewater treatment facility, and all those little green dots that you see are sanitary sewer overflows that occurred within that 2-year period. So sanitary sewer overflow is literally untreated raw sewage sort of bubbling up out of a main line, out of the manhole covers that exist in the streets, and then getting into the water, getting onto the street and then into the watershed. So that's actually quite a lot of dots for a 2-year period. And the interesting thing about it is that in our research, as we started to work with them and map the location of these dots, you might think that, it's related to industry and pollution from industry, or from, concentrations of restaurants, or other things that produce like a lot of materials like fats and greases and other, things that might clog these drains. But the truth is the majority of these were occurring in dispersed areas of residential zones. So this wasn't just like a hot spot in one location. This wasn't at like the concentration of some sort of industry. This was literally sort of sprinkled throughout and in residential areas. So the challenge is difficult, right? Because it's if you can't find that one spot where the issue is, it's not as easy as saying, we'll just increase the sewer line, like its capacity. We'll literally get a larger main line, right? But the larger main line would literally need to be dispersed against, this entire kind of filigree. So as consultants working with the city trying to address this issue, we really tried to engage with all the different facets of this problem, not just from the GIS data and that kind of analysis, but we also visited the water treatment facility and learned about the issues there. We spent time sort of riding and shadowing with different folks from ESD, from the Environmental Service Department and DOT to understand what it looks like to maintain these lines. And then we actually identified different existing community groups, most of them mothers groups associated with elementary schools that were located in areas in which we sort of found an aggregation of these kind of residential sanitary sewer overflow areas. And so in working in all these kind of various ways and with engaging with these individuals, we started to learn some really interesting things. We started to learn things in these community meetings about the fact that most folks weren't homeowners, for example, that they were somewhat aware of the infrastructure in the city, but not so much. And these were large families that lived in this area, average of 5 individuals, multi-generational families. These meetings typically took place in English, Spanish, and in Vietnamese, because these neighborhoods were also sort of concentrations of non-English speaking immigrant communities. It didn't really work to walk into these meetings talking about sanitary sewer overflows. So instead, we returned to this idea about food and cooking, because it seemed like a better way to have a conversation about what kind of household practices might be undertaken within a home. We showed the classic Norman Rockwell. I love this image, by the way, because just looking at in terms of like thinking through the gender roles in this really iconic image. You know that grandpa's gonna be carving that turkey, right? It's being presented to him and he's wearing the suit, but grandma's in the apron and ostensibly was probably the person who prepared this turkey, and that's why it's being brought to the table. And so we did this kind of, oh, well, what happens afterwards with all the dirty dishes and the leftover carcass? That's probably also going to be grandma, right? That predominantly we see this sort of pattern. And, you know, that was reinforced in our conversations with community members. So we came to this central idea that your sink is actually part of the watershed. We sort of came up with this idea that, you know, if you have a bathroom, you have a waterfront home. And so there was a need to sort of be careful about what it is you put into sinks, into toilets, into drains, because they had this impact to a broader infrastructure and the watershed as a whole. So working with community members, we developed some graphics that made that connection more clear. So from the household, like things like how you manage grease and what grease waste look like, how that's connected underground to things like the infrastructure of sewers and the wastewater treatment plant, and then again, how that's related to the watershed and different endangered species. And it was really interesting because in working with the individuals in these communities, they were all interested in being good stewards of the environment, but it was really hard to make that connection between like this drain and then this broader watershed. And so these graphics were meant to do that. And then these graphics got reinforced. So they got distributed to different homes. We started making manhole covers to sort of plant that seed, that like that graphic that you saw that arrived in your home, it's out in the street. We engaged with students who would then use this chrome green colored chalk to mark all the clean outs in their neighborhood. So these like little artifacts of this infrastructure started to become, you know, a little bit more apparent. We had truck wraps produced for the actual sewer maintenance vehicles. And one of the things I'm really proud about is that this whole process was, you know, in collaboration with the individuals who already serve the sewer system. So it wasn't like, oh, we're gonna do this thing and you're gonna just have to sort of deal with it, right? Instead, it was like, collectively, what are things that would actually make your job easier? What can you get behind? How might you help us implement this? And so they actually really got behind spray painting manholes because they said it shortened the time to do their work because they could find it quickly. Sometimes manholes were covered with asphalt and debris and they had trouble like locating it. So it was really helpful for them. And oftentimes they were in communities where they didn't speak the language of the residents. So we had these printed in various languages so that they had something that they could distribute to homeowners and sort of explain to them what was, you know, what they were doing in their neighborhood and what role they were playing. And here they are they also helped fold them all for us, which was really nice. And then the city of San Jose has like this really classic concrete brutalist building, which is like just perfect for this kind of installation, where we applied the chrome green tape, right, to show that, you know, in this building, in the street, on the walls, there's this infrastructure that's really important, really vital, and we just don't see it. There was a digital component to all of this as well, using social media. Back when I did have a Twitter account and Instagram, right, we started to create networks of folks who were then also sharing best practices for managing grease waste within these locations. And I'm happy to say that the results of that engagement effort and the designed pieces that came out of it, we actually saw a reduction in sanitary sewer overflows in the city of San Jose following this pilot. And so now it's already been rolled out beyond the handful of neighborhoods we started in and is now throughout the city. And as a result, we won in 2016 the Teng Wu Pollution Prevention Award from the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Board. And we were also a finalist for Place by Design from South by Southwest. But one of my favorite rewards from this effort was that when I started going into these mothering groups to talk about fog waste and talk about like washing dishes and, cleaning up after cooking, and what are you cooking? I was actually pregnant with my son at the time, and so I came in. It's kind of hard to see, but the got a little bit. And then my son was born, and I actually brought him with me to these meetings. And you can see there are other children and infants in the room, and people would just pass my baby around while I was giving these talks or while we were working through ideas. And it was the first time that I realized that something that was a part of my identity that I was trying to kind of push to the back, like in my professional settings, was actually of value to my work. I believe that connection that we made with the community members, the success that we had, really did come from like embracing a piece of my identity and embedding that actually into my design process. So that's gone on to impact how I teach. And quite honestly, I could spend 50 minutes talking about any one of these little pictures that represent some of the student work that I've undertaken recently. But just to say that what that whole research and practice process taught me was that, we need to reconsider what we value if we can adopt a philosophy in which maintenance matters, right? Because the skill sets are different. Design, we often look to craft, we often look to drawing, we often look to model making and, aesthetic forms as markers of being, good work. But when we're talking about maintenance instead as being a critical part of placemaking, we have to ask ourselves, what are the values associated with making you a good maintainer or a good caretaker, right? And so a lot of my work now is really thinking about a praxis of care embedded in my pedagogy. And in doing so, the products and the skills are totally different. So, in some of these, it's like understanding how cooking for your friends is a skill, right? It's community building, it's significant. It can have impacts to learning outcomes and a sense of place, right? This is a student who collaged images of his family in a kind of interrogation of a concept of home and belonging as a critical part of a housing studio. So like replacing words like house with home and understanding different values. Or a student who struggled throughout because she was not a great draftsperson and her drawings kind of never told exactly what it was that she had in her mind, but she could cross stitch and embroider, and she started to use those kind of mending skills to start to communicate the values that she wanted to instill in her placemaking. So again, it's like recognizing that maybe we need to rethink what's important about that design process and challenge the ways in which we teach. I wanted to end on this one study that I think really brings together why this is of paramount importance currently, in light of all the socio-ecological challenges with climate change that we have right now. So this is a study conducted in 2017 by Daniel Aldrich. It's a longitudinal study of the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima nuclear fallout in Japan, where he's followed a handful of about a dozen communities throughout Japan to see how they recovered from that disaster over the course of, at this point, it's been over 10 years. And throughout that process, he looked for markers of resilience. And I don't mean resilience like, economic vitality. He looked at real resilience, like was the individuals who used to live here, did they return, right? Did the industries, the businesses that used to, exist there, did those come back? Not new, not gentrification, not displacement, but like really looking at resilience. And it was really interesting because he was looking for what was the common thread in the communities that did rebound, that did recover to its original kinds of conditions. And it wasn't infrastructure. It wasn't early earthquake or flood warnings. It wasn't like stockpiling of water or batteries or any other kinds of the things that we think about when we think about like building like climate change resilience or natural disaster resilience. It was something really simple. It was whether or not they knew their neighbors. That was the number one kind of like common ground between all the communities that really recovered, is how well they had a sense of social networks and communities. And so when we think about that and those social networks and how they matter and how we build them, I would argue that that's maintenance, right? It takes more maintenance than innovation to really think about building those networks and again, maintaining them. And so with this concept of maintenance as placemaking, I hope we can start to really challenge the skills that we think are necessary to design for the challenges that we face. So thank you. I need this. I would love to take any questions. Or you're all hungry for dinner. I was warned that sometimes that happens. Everyone just stands up and goes to dinner. Yeah. Ah, that's a great question. That was, what's the hierarchy of the room when doing engagement? And the photos that I've shown are probably not the best examples of what that engagement strategy looked like. It definitely shouldn't look like what we have right here, right? Like, here I am telling you things, I'm an expert. No, it is really sitting like at the table with folks, acknowledging expertise comes in many forms. So yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you know, our later meetings were just that. Can I ask a follow-up? Sure. No, it was very much the same kind of, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we had similar sorts of, I mean, they were really shocked when we were like, can we spend the day riding in the DOT truck with you? And like wearing the overalls and the lime green vest and like, you know, looking at cameras in you know, maintenance holes. But it was really critical for us, like to really understand what that looked like to maintain. So yeah, there was, but yeah, I mean, that was a value. That was an expertise that we needed to understand. Yes. As opposed to landscape architects. Yeah. So I was wondering about who. Oh, that's a really good question. So yes, so I do almost all my work with my design partner, Brett Snyder. Actually said, do you want to come down here with me? And he said, February in Ohio? I'll let you go alone. Anyhow, yeah, so we call ourselves environmental artists because in that particular poster and at the call from the city of San Jose was for environmental artists. So we were responding to the call, but I think more often I identified myself as a landscape architect. He's an architect and graphic designer. And I'll be totally honest that when the call came out, we would jump through any hoop to get through it because I love sewers. Helena knows. I don't know why. I love sewers. I think they're fascinating, right? And we love engagement work. And it was like, what? A community engagement work where I get to learn about sewers? Like, we're probably the only people who are this excited about it. Hopefully it showed. So I will admit that was jumping through a hoop to say, yeah, we're environmental artists. Yes. But I do think that it was, it was important to us when we went and met with community members to be clear also that we had these other sets of skills, that we brought to the table. Yeah. Thank you.
I just wondered about pedagogy and how or if you implement maintenance inside the classroom or active learning with maintenance. Do you do that?
So I unfortunately do not have to get to teach the classes that have that component to it, but we do have a series of design build studios now. They're actually some of our first core studios in the landscape architecture program, so that we think it's really important that students understand what they're asking when they say, ooh, and I imagine a concrete wall here. So our construction materials course is one where they actually build. And so they're pouring concrete, but the thing that they hate about, they actually get to design some projects and then they work together to construct it. I wish I had some images of it because it's really beautiful too, the work that they do. But the interesting thing is that they also have to do site prep. So like they're doing things like weeding, they're doing things like pruning, they're definitely getting kind of that experience of like what it takes to maintain sites as part of that practice. Yeah. No, I wish. That's my studio. That's when we go on the sewer tours. Yes. Other questions? Nothing too controversial about. Yeah. Oh, Tamika.
So I was really interested in this moment of kind of getting out into the community and understanding, where these people are coming from and how we may invite them to participate in this type of work and maintenance within the home. Can you expand on the amount of time from first meeting to actually seeing results of that process?
I'll just say that my son, who I'm pregnant with, he's 10 now, So this is not like short, quick work. It's a really long-term investment to build trust, to make you right, to be part of that community in a certain form that doesn't feel like I'm just coming in, telling you what you need to do, and then stepping away. That's the challenge of community-based work. One is that, yes, it takes a lot of time, and two, also there's not a lot of flashy photos. Like, I have to admit, I also was like a little bit like, I don't have that like $1 million shot of the project, because it was always a little scrappy. It was always a little, rough around the edges, but there was a sense of ownership from all that was involved. And so, yeah, that's the trade-off of that kind of practice. Yeah, thanks for the question. Forbes.
I really appreciated the lecture and this tying it back to very much the kind of municipal housekeeping and that connection to, city scale infrastructure, which is often hard to kind of comprehend. But then very much tying it to an individual and bodily practices of maintenance in the home. Where do you see, like, after this project, like, what's the next phase of that work? What are other ways of kind of engaging this entanglement between domesticity and infrastructure?
Oh, that's a hard question to answer without getting really political. I don't know. I mean, maybe it shouldn't be unpaid labor. Yeah, I think there is definitely a social cultural revolution that maybe we're on the precipice of. I'd like to hope. That's why I love working with young people, because I think there's a change in the air. And part of that is acknowledging new forms of contributions to society, like new ways of honoring knowledge, and being completely aware that I'm in a position of privilege when I say that as a tenured faculty member, right, in an academic institution, to say, we need to change academia and what we value. But a lot of times, one of the things I think is really interesting is in the work of Ellen Swallow Richards was this idea of, yes, she's a chemist, and there's a lot of credentials that she holds and a lot of research that she's conducting, but then she's coming home and she's saying, oh, here I am washing a dish, and there's a relationship to that water quality that I was just talking about. So it's this idea of like really thinking about positionality and understanding that we're not siloed individuals, that we're like these really full, complicated people, and this idea that there are ways to make contributions besides publishing the paper, besides building the building or the landscape, that like me deciding what my family eats every night as I cook a meal is important. I mean, that was the like really empowering message that we were taking to these meetings, that folks were saying, oh, right, like, right? So, but we shared the medal with them. They have the Teng Wu Award because we felt like it was theirs, but what if they were paid for best practices, right? What if they were, I mean, if we think about the ways in which the pandemic really upended lives and how clear it became that we hadn't evolved from particular kinds of roles, gendered roles, I do think that there's like this, the first step is kind of acknowledging it, and then maybe that leads to more change. Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't know if I actually answered it, but thank you. I saw a hand there and then here. Yeah.
My question is there a format or perhaps a template that community-based work can be extended into other locations?
Ooh, no. Sorry, if I'm being totally honest, no. I mean, I think the hardest part is that like there is no textbook on community engagement because there's no one community. And I think in the work that I've done, the handful of folks that I've had the privilege to collaborate with, it looks totally different, right? It's like environmental design. Like, should we really be putting the same building in every single location around the world, or every park look the same, right? There are so many different nuances to place and people that, for me, it evolves every single time.
But you must understand it's not happening at all. So while it need not be so rigorous and so limited, is there a way that a general approach to this can be applied to?
So maybe that takes the role of how I teach and understanding that, this kind of newer crop of designers recognizes that like one of the skills that they need is how to approach individuals with humility. I mean, I think that's part of it. Recognizing how to acknowledge other kinds of expertise besides the kind of credentialed academic versions of that. So I think that's the contribution. So that as whether you're an architect, a planner, a landscape architect, urban designer, right, you're stepping into these roles where you might be proposing change, and recognizing that the individuals that have to experience this change and live this change might not be participating in that decision making. Yeah, so I think that's, for me, is the moment. It's not a kind of carte blanche, we should all do X, Y, Z, but just saying things like, what are the skills that you want to bring when you're starting to make decisions about a place? Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
How do you situate community service organizations in your framework of maintenance?
Ooh, how do I situate community service organizations in my framework of maintenance? Ooh, I don't know if I've actually, so when you say community service organizations, are you thinking like nonprofit orgs that are doing community-based work, or
The most immediate example is like student orgs that have an event called like Clean Your Streams or fraternity
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think that kind of work is like really important, right? And this idea that there are folks that are already doing maintenance work. I think for us, in any situation where we may be working with a site, a place, a context, a community, one of our first kind of site analyses is asking like who are the people that we need to be engaging with, and if those community-based service organizations exist, we want to work with them. We want to collaborate with them in a way that we're asking what does our skill set potentially have to be a service of the work that you're doing, right? So I think that idea of partnerships is really important. But it also takes like a lot of time and trust to establish that. So I've had other work working in watersheds. It's interesting you mentioned a creek. We worked in the lower Alameda Creek watershed for part of another project, and identifying that there was this group of folks that were already really committed to maintaining and cleaning on a volunteer basis that watershed, and making sure that they were always a part of any kind of conversation that was being had about like what would be the future of this place as that process was unfolding. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think those folks are probably doing more than I could. I mean, that's kind of the thing, is like, right? Like, if you're picking up the trash every day in front of the building, like ask yourself, like the folks who empty the trash cans here, and I know what a design school's trash bin looks like. Holy shit, right? Think about that contribution on a daily basis and what that means to this building, right? And whether you know those names versus do you know the name of the individual that designed the building, right? And like, so what does that mean in terms of like who we value and who we attribute to as the placemaker, right? Well, thank you for your questions and your time.